Welcome to episode 1 of the Route podcast. I'm actually not Joe Rogan. I'm Christopher Nascimento, but I'll tell you a bit more about me later on. As for right now, let me tell you quickly about the Route podcast. So I'll give you the what, the who, and the who again. So what is the Route? The Route is essentially a glorified sports business coffee chat. And as for the first who will our guests be? So it'll be a new guest every single episode, and they'll share their journeys throughout their sports business careers, and they'll tell us how they got to where they are today or where they plan on going. As for the last two, who is the podcast ideally for? Ideally, it's for those looking to enter the sports industry but aren't sure about which route to take, or for those who are my fans. Shout out to you guys. As for me, as I mentioned, I'm Christopher Nascimento. There's actually an episode I created. It's called Episode 0. You can hear all about me there if you'd like to know more. Or you can follow me on Twitter or Instagram at Nascimento MKTG. So Nascimento Marketing, NASCIMENTO MKTG on Twitter or Instagram.
I'd now like to welcome Jacob Kelly to the Route podcast. Thanks for joining.
It's my pleasure, man. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, no problem. To start, would you mind giving the listeners a little quick summary of yourself in the sense of where you started, what you did, where you are now, what you're currently doing? Just something like that.
Just like a quick synopsis, like a 30-second. So I work for the Ottawa Sports and Entertainment Group. I am the digital coordinator for the Ottawa REDBLACKS. So I run their social media, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter. I'm also responsible for some of the email communication on behalf of the team, as well as some content that goes up on the website. I started with them over 2.5 years ago now. I started with the Ottawa 67s. I did 2 seasons with the 67s. And then I transitioned over after last 67 season into the REDBLACKS. And I've managed the REDBLACKS for a season now. And I'm heading into my second season now.
Sure. And I just want to add in quickly that you also host your own podcast, My Social Life on the Side. Do you want to touch on that quickly?
Yeah. So My Social Life is a podcast, which a lot of people are surprised has nothing to do with my job or sports at all. It's social media related, hence the name My Social Life. And so I sit down, I interview people that do interesting things on social media. So whether that be like influencers, YouTubers, social media managers, people that work for social media startups, different things like that. So anyone with an interesting story, anyone doing anything interesting on social media, I try and sit down and like tell their story in a very narrative base. Like we'll start at the beginning and work our way through their whole story up to where they are now. So that's been a fun project I'm working on for about 1.5 years now. I've recorded 77 of those.
Yeah. Well, yeah, that's all great stuff. I've been listening, so it's all interesting. I'm trying to listen more. So just to kind of start off, you mentioned your route previously. Let's start with your education. What attracted you to attend college for marketing?
Honestly, I was thinking on this the other day, like I went to school for marketing, but I don't even know if I fully understood what that meant. I think I wanted to do business, and marketing was kind of like the widest. I could go so many directions with it. So, but I was so naive when I went to school for marketing. Like I can remember being 17 and talking to a friend about how I'm going to school for marketing. Like, what does that mean? I'm like, I kind of just like try to trick people into buying products. Like you just kind of like lie to them without actually lying. And I was like, that's so stupid now, like thinking back on that. But so I did marketing all through high school, or like business all through high school. Okay. The school I went to, so I grew up in Manitoba. And there was a business diploma that you could get through high school.
Oh, really?
So they had you had to take like 8 or 9 courses that fall under the business umbrella. Yeah. And so I did that. So I took all the core business courses, and there's some other ones like different computer classes or like accounting. So I took enough that I was able to graduate with my business diploma. And so I just wanted to continue doing business. And I think Algonquin's the only school that actually accepted me. So, so I got accepted into marketing at Algonquin. I'm from Ottawa originally, so I lived here till I was 9, and then I moved out to Manitoba. Yeah. So I moved back. I was able to live with my grandparents, so I was able to save. I didn't have to pay for residence or anything like that. I was able to save a ton of money by coming back to Ottawa ultimately in the long run, because if I'd gone to school, so I lived about 45 minutes to an hour outside of Winnipeg, hour and a half probably through traffic to get to the school. Like I'd probably have to stay in residence had I stayed in Manitoba. Sure. So coming back to Ottawa was actually the best move for me. I think I wanted to ultimately anyways. Like I didn't want to get stuck in Manitoba. So that's kind of how I ended up going to school. Very long answer for how I ended up going to school for marketing.
So you touched on the start where initially you didn't really know what marketing was, but it seemed interesting. When did it click ever when you're in Algonquin that, you know what, this is for me?
I think just kind of like as I fell into marketing through Algonquin, I got comfortable and I really enjoyed what I was learning, and I enjoyed doing that. And then ultimately it was through that, like we started doing different competitions and stuff like that. And I really jumped into it head first. I think I always kind of growing up, I was academic. So I always tried to be good academically. So just doing those extracurriculars was just something that kind of came natural to me, but I really enjoyed them. It was like marketing case competitions and stuff like that. And I really enjoyed it. And found I had a bit of a knack for it. I was doing well in school, and that's kind of when I just knew I wanted to go. Well, actually, it's not even true. So I did the marketing, but then I didn't really know what I was going to do after. So I graduated, and then it was just a 2 year. I came straight out of high school, did it in 2 years. I was 19, and I was like, I don't really know what my next move is going to be. So I actually enrolled in a couple different programs after. I ultimately accepted a postgraduate to do interactive multimedia management, which is like photography, videography, web design, all that stuff. But if you take it not as a postgrad, it's a 2 year, but the postgrad's 1 year. And they take the whole 2 year and they cram it into a year. So they double the workload and cut the time in half. Yeah. So I talked to the program coordinator there, and he was like, yeah, it's probably about 70 to 80 hours a week worth of work to do this program. And it was probably like somewhere between $12,000 to $14,000. And I was I'm not really down to pay 12 to 14 grand and not really be able to have a part-time job, because I'm going to be doing all that work. So I was like, I could probably self-teach photography, videography, design, which is a big part of my job. Not a big part, but it's a part of my job now that I have self-taught. So ultimately I dropped out of that program, and then I just kind of decided I wanted to get a job in marketing because I enjoyed my program there. So I kind of just fell into it more so than anything, but I love it now.
Yeah, of course. So you kind of touched on, you decided to self-teach yourself. Is there specifically something where a specific site, specific tools, what did you use to teach
YouTube?
YouTube, kind of.
Yeah. YouTube tutorials are amazing.
Yeah.
You can learn so much just by and if it's not on YouTube, Google it.
Of course.
Like you can find a tutorial for absolutely anything. So it's not like I sat down and I was like, okay, I need to learn how to do photography. Yeah. I need to I need to take a photography course online or something like that. It was like I just started doing it, and I would hit roadblocks of things I don't know how to do, or I would see someone else do something. I'm like, how did they do that? So I would search up doing that specific thing. So it's not like I tried to learn photography by watching YouTube tutorials for a week or something. I just did it, learned by doing it, and then when I wasn't able to figure out how to do something, that's when the tutorials would come into play.
Yeah, that's a great way to. I've done that for a few things, but now that you're mentioning it, I'm like, oh, that's a great way to do stuff. So you kind of touched on your education side, but what really got your start in marketing? So once you completed Algonquin, what kind of gave you your first opportunity?
So I had an internship that I did. It was a part-time internship downtown at a non-for-profit called Health Partners. And then it was there when I was still supposed to go back to school. So the internship ran until mid-end August, and then it was done because I was going back to school. And then I kind of had a moment where I was like, I don't want to go back to school. I don't really enjoy it. Or not that I don't enjoy it, but I don't want to go into that specific program. So I reached out to my program coordinator from marketing, and I was like, hey, I've decided not to take the postgraduate. If you know anybody looking for a marketing student that's recently graduated, let me know, or looking for someone in their marketing department that's recently graduated, let me know, because I'm looking. Just happened to be the exact same day that a fellow contact that knows me, but went through my program, probably 6-7 years older than I am. He's like, hey, my client OSEG is looking for someone that's recently graduated marketing for their marketing department. Do you know of anybody? And that was the same day that I reached out saying I'm looking. So it's just very serendipitous that way and very lucky. Of course. And then, so I was obviously top of mind for him. He knew sports was an interest of mine. So he sent him my name. He sent my name to OSEG. And then from there, I just got into OSEG.
Yeah, wow. So everything fell into place.
Super lucky. And I had a ton of references. That's what I tried to do. Anyone and everyone that I knew that knew someone in OSEG, I got them to call in for me. Smart, so obviously this guy that first referred me gave me a good reference. My manager at the not-for-profit at the time, she knew somebody. So I had 2 managers. My first manager, she knew someone there, so she called in. My girlfriend's grandpa did sales for the Ottawa Rough Riders back in the day. So he's still connected. So he called in and gave me a reference. This is my favorite one. So my girlfriend's dad directs CTV Morning Live.
Oh, okay.
Henry Burris hosted CTV Morning Live. Yeah. So my girlfriend's dad and Henry Burris are buddies now. So Henry Burris called in and gave me a reference. I don't know who he called. Yeah. He told me he called. He swears he called. I told him to call Matt Jackowitz. He's like, yeah, I know Matt. He called a Matt, not Matt Jackowitz. Okay. So ultimately, Henry Burris didn't actually help me get the job. He did call. Yeah. Gave a reference to me to someone, but I still don't know who that was.
That would have pushed you over the top.
Yeah, but I got it anyways. But it's just cool that. So technically, he did call in and give me a recommendation. But so I think ultimately, I can't remember everyone now, but I had 7 people call in and recommend me. So it was kind of through that I was able to get it.
That's ideal. Everyone just knew what to do and everything's falling into place.
Yeah.
So when you were just talking there, you kind of said you knew people that were at OSEG or in different sports industry, but what would you say to someone that doesn't really have that connection or that tie to a team or to someone in the industry?
Like, how do they get connections? Like, how do they meet people?
Like, what would you recommend for someone? Because I've met people at networking events where they have no ties, they have no connections, and they're just starting from scratch. And they're like, what do I do? So what would you say to them?
Use social media.
Okay. Yeah.
Do what you're doing.
That's
what I would tell someone. Create a scenario where you provide value up front for someone that will allow them to talk to you.
Yeah.
Right. So like, or you can even just like, some people, you don't need to provide value, like going for coffees like you've done as well. Yeah. But a thing that I tell people with my podcast is, even if no one listens, I'm making a ton of connections that way.
Yeah, of course.
For the most part, I've done 77 interviews. Probably like 2-3 of them are people I knew before. Everyone else I didn't know.
Yeah.
So the podcast gives people a reason to talk to me that they wouldn't have otherwise.
For sure.
So my advice to someone would be to either connect with people on LinkedIn, interview them somehow. Maybe you like to do a podcast. Maybe it's you writing articles. Like that's a great way, is to interview people, is a great way to make those connections and really put your work into it. Because if they know that this isn't something you're getting paid for, this isn't for a school assignment, you're just doing it because you genuinely want to do this and you want to interview them. If you put the work into it, that's going to stand out to them, that no one's paying you, no one's asking you to do this, but you're doing it anyways. You're doing a lot of work into it. So that'd be my biggest advice, is to do something like that. Worst case scenario, you can just try and connect with people through LinkedIn and use it that way, but try and find a way to provide some form of value to them that's not just asking to meet them for coffee. You know what I mean?
For sure. I think that's great advice. Now just going back to your role. So you got all those people to call in for you. Mm-hmm. Now let's talk about your role once you got to the 67s. What did you do, and what did it entail, and what challenges may have you have faced while you're there?
Yeah, so I started with the 67s. I guess I was 19 at the time. I was just doing what I do now. So I was technically my role is growth hacker.
Yeah.
But I just tell everyone it's digital coordinator. Everyone understands that more.
Yeah.
It's a whole thing. But I think for me, like, it was just kind of getting sorry, can you repeat the question?
Sure, yeah. So we were just talking about what you did. You got a few people to call in for you. Everything fell into place. So I wanted to dive into, once you finally got the job at the 67s, what do you do there, or what did you do there? What challenges did you face, and what kind of things did you learn?
So, I mean, ultimately, being the digital coordinator is responsible for social media.
Yeah.
And through Algonquin, we touched on social media at the time, but I don't think we dove fully into it. So a lot of the stuff I know about social and all that, I kind of have self-taught and learned through doing it. At the time, like, we touched on it, of course, it was a component, but there wasn't like a dedicated class or anything. So I learned a little bit through my internship, but it wasn't anything crazy. Like, I remember there I was writing copy for a month. So it'd be like, come up with 30 posts that we can make on Twitter this month, write them all out, we'll approve them, and you kind of schedule them. So, and then just like random stuff. So I wasn't really like learning social. So I had to learn social when I got on the job, but so I was responsible for just posting about the 67. So at the time, like, the structures changed here and there. So at the time, like, everyone did a little bit of every brand, but there was a brand lead, and now we're siloed. So there's one person responsible for each brand within OSEG. But I was the 67's lead at the time, so I was responsible for covering games. We were all responsible for covering games and stuff, keep posting about the team, email marketing, stuff like that. But I think the biggest challenge for me was my second year, actually, when we all kind of got that silo where I was 67's, only 67's, but all of 67's. And then there's someone for the REDBLACKS at the time. There's someone for the Fury, which no longer exists in TD Place. And going into that with the 67's, it's 68 games I have to cover. Yeah. So I have to watch every single game. I have to be there for all the home games. I have to live tweet. I have to update. I have to make graphics, all that stuff. And that was the biggest challenge for me, was trying to figure out how to balance that. And I don't think I actually did it well. I don't think I found a way to do it well, because just the way we're structured, there's so much going on. There's like, it's not like you can, if you work Friday, Saturday, Sunday, you work 3 games, you can take those 3 days off, because there's so much that happens and so much that goes into promoting a game and keeping up with the social media channels, that you can't just take the day off. Because I tell people, if I take a sick day, so do the Ottawa REDBLACKS. Or at the time, so do the 67s. So I think the biggest challenge for me doing it was trying to figure out that balance. And I don't think I did a good job. I think I'm getting better at it. And the girl that's doing it now, her name is Haley Davis. She's really good at kind of finding that balance, a lot better than I was. But that was the biggest thing, is trying to figure out how to balance 68 games. Yeah, that's a lot. Plus, I did my podcast in that time. So I did a podcast every single week during that time as well. So it's just, I think finding the balance was the hardest thing that I had to learn.
Sure. And then just kind of touching on balance. You're talking about home games. You guys had to be there and always live tweet, post the scores, things like that. What would you guys do for away games? Because I know sometimes the 67s, at least for being myself in Quebec, we don't really see the games sometimes on Sportsnet. So what would you do for away games?
There's a streaming service called
Okay.
OHL Live.
Yeah.
So OSEC will just buy me one and I have to watch it. Sometimes the stream is a little bit tough. So if the stream doesn't work or the quality is really bad, I'll just listen to the game.
Okay, yeah, of course.
But one thing that I kind of playing into balance a little bit, not really, but what I tried to do is I tried to just keep those games minimal, because home games is different because everyone's there, the atmosphere's fun, people are watching the game and checking their phone at the same time. But whereas when it's on Twitter on an away game, like you said, not a lot of people watch away games, right? Because I think they're only available on Rogers, and not everyone has Rogers cable, so they can't watch it. So I would just keep it minimally, goals, maybe a fight or any big plays, but like home games I tweet about like penalties and power plays and stuff like that. But Twitter, it's not necessarily as important. Like, or sorry, not Twitter, for away games on Twitter, it's not necessarily as important. So I kind of kept it minimal. So I'd be able to kind of like listen to the radio while maybe doing something else, and then I could still cover the game at the same time. But so road games, it's just watching it from home.
Okay. What would you say the percentage or the breakdown is of off the cuff tweets and scheduled tweets or posts on other social media platforms?
I mean, for games, it's all off the cuff.
All off the cuff, but what would you say in the other terms of other posts? Would you say it's 50-50? Let's say you do 1,000 posts in the month of November. How many of what percentage would you say is off the cuff? And
I mean, a lot of them are off the cuff. Like I don't have any set stuff. Like everything, technically everything is scheduled. Because like I'll have posts, but I don't want to, because maybe I just made a post 20 minutes ago. I don't want to post twice in the same hour and then not for the rest of the day. So a lot of my stuff is scheduled, but a lot of it's off the cuff as well. I mean, I'm trying to figure out the best way to explain it. Like obviously there's stuff I have to post about. Like we're launching our season seat campaign. So I obviously have to post about that, but nothing's like scheduled. I just kind of
right timing, right place, stuff like that.
Yeah.
Okay. And then did your role develop furthermore, or was it basically that when you're with the 67s?
Pretty much the same. Nothing. I mean, obviously, like different things will come up, but like for all intents and purposes, it's pretty much the same for the last 2.5 years. Obviously, the role has changed with the Red Blacks and different stuff like that. But for the most part, I'm doing a lot of the same stuff. Like sometimes, like I was doing Facebook ads for a while, and that went away. There's a point where email marketing went away, but now it's back to me. So it kind of just always constantly changing. But for the most part, it's pretty much the same role.
Sure. So now that you're with the Red Blacks and you're kind of in a similar position, just different team, is the workload and the type of work you're doing similar, or what are the differences?
It's similar. I would honestly say that it's not easier, but it's less of a workload with the Red Blacks. Sure. Because there's one game a week. Yeah, some weeks there's no games because I got 3 buys. Yeah. So it's like I went and I didn't get like, so beforehand when everyone did everyone was responsible to help out on all the brands, which we still help each other out, but not to the same extent. There was no off season. Like we all just would all have to cover games for all the 3 teams. But then once we switched to this individual structure, we got off seasons again. Of course, which is something that we never experienced before. But then when I did the 67s, I did it all the way through playoffs, which playoffs was an awesome experience. I was traveling at that point. But with the Red Blacks, the guy that did it before me left kind of 2 weeks after the season. So the 67s, I think playoffs ended on a Sunday. I worked from home Monday. Tuesday, I got offered the Red Blacks job. Oh, wow. And it's a quick turnaround. So I didn't have an off season. So I went from 3 games a week, pretty much every week, to 1 game a week. That was the biggest change for me when it came to the Red Blacks. Obviously, as well, with the Red Blacks, it's a bigger brand. There's more eyes on it. Of course, So you have to be a little bit more careful. Like typos, I could get away with from time to time on the 67s one, but you can't get away with the typo on the Red Blacks account. Someone will let you know pretty much right away. But other than that, the transition wasn't too bad. The games, there's a lot more happening at a Red Blacks home game, especially because there's only 9. There's that much more pressure to make sure everything goes well. Whereas 67s, I messed up on Friday. Oh, well, I'll do it Saturday and Sunday the right way. But Red Blacks, so I would say there's more pressure because there's more eyeballs and there's more attention and it's a bigger brand. But other than that, like I found it was a pretty easy transition for me to go from one to the other. And then you're just kind of talking about the work week where the 67s was maybe 3 games a week and then Red Blacks is 1. What would you do when it wasn't a game day for the Red Blacks? Like, what type of stuff would you do? I'd be promoting the game that's coming up. I'd be making sure the feeds stay consistent. There's stuff going up. I'd go out to the field. I do the media scrums. So I'll ask the players the questions and stuff like that. Just making sure we have content that's coming, making sure we're planning how we're going to promote the next games, building out certain elements that are happening at some games. So different things like that. So just making sure that the feeds staying consistent, the emails are getting written and all that stuff.
For sure. What would you say would you be like going to practice? Would you be interacting with the players a lot of the time, or what was that?
A little bit, that was probably another transition that I had to make was making sure it was establishing those relationships. That was something I wasn't good at, especially my first year. So I started 19, turned 20. So I was technically, when I started, I was like, I still could have not based off talent, but based off age. I was within the age range to play in the OHL. So I found it difficult to be like, that was something I struggled with, was trying to build that relationship as like someone on the outside when they're all, so I did a better job of that my second season. I really felt like I was a part of the 67s, especially the playoffs, because I was traveling and staying in the hotel, eating with the team and stuff like that. But with Red Blacks, I was trying to establish relationships with all the players. So the guy before was still around a little bit as we did that transition. So he kind of introduced me to a couple guys, but then it was through doing the interviews on the field where I interacted with the players the most. Also, we did Ask It Bud, which is our Facebook live show. So I DM players on Instagram and get them for that. But now I think a lot of the players do know who I am and doing the podcast as well. And that'll be a good chance for me to really kind of build those relationships even more. Because like I said, I record. Oh, we weren't talking about that on this podcast, but we started a podcast for Red Blacks. And so the players, we record in my apartment. So they come to my home and we talk for like 45 minutes about their life and their childhood and stuff. So I'm really building relationships better that way. So the interaction with the players is growing from when I started, to kind of answer your question.
Yeah, I was actually just about to ask you about the Red Blacks Unfiltered podcast you guys just started. So kind of want to touch on what gave you the idea to start it and what excites you about this upcoming project.
Well, I mean, obviously, the obvious answer is I have a podcast.
Yeah.
But even before I started my podcast about a year after I started at OSEG. So when I started at OSEG, I went through all of our social channels and Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, like for all the different teams that we have. And I wrote down what I liked, what I didn't like, what we could do, different ideas. And one of the things I wrote down was Red Blacks podcast. 2.5 years ago, I wrote that down. And it's never happened.
Of course,
I didn't even think I was going to be hosting it in the first place. Like, it was just an idea. Someone should host it. We should do this podcast. And then ultimately, like, I started my podcast a year later, and I always, whenever we'd have like innovation meetings or stuff like that, I'd always pitch a podcast. And a podcast was an idea that always got brought up. Our pre-season like planning sessions, like what are we going to do throughout the season? Podcast would come up. I brought it up for 67s. I brought it up for Red Blacks. I actually shot a 67s podcast.
Oh, really?
On the road last year in Hamilton, I think. That's where we recorded it. Never made it to the air. Never posted it. We have clips from it. Never did anything with it. But then ultimately, I've still been wanting to start one. It's not happening because I got to get everyone involved and try and organize it. I was at the gym one day and I was like, why don't I just do it myself? Like,
your mindset.
I don't have to, like, I clearly, through my own podcast, I have the gear, I have the space, I have like kind of like a little studio space in my apartment. I could just do it and see what happens. And so I went into work on Monday, or a couple days. I designed a cover art. I came up with a name. And then I wrote a big email to like my boss and some of the department heads or the bosses of other departments. So like the partnerships, because like, hey, you guys can sponsor this. And like the communications team, like, by the way, we're going to start putting this out. Like if media asks, this is what we're doing. And I sent a big long plan, the name of the podcast, what the premise is, the tagline, who we're interviewing, where we're going to be interviewing it, I'm hosting it, why I'm hosting it, the whole thing. This is how the podcast is going to be. This is what I'm going to do. And I just kind of did that until someone told me not to, or someone told me to stop, and no one did. So I just kind of went with it. I recorded the first one. The first one's actually the second episode. So I recorded the first podcast. J People Do came to my apartment. We recorded it. And then I was just made the decision that once we signed Nick Arbuckle, we're going to wait. And when Arbuckle comes to town, we're going to record a podcast with Nick Arbuckle. We'll launch with that because there'll be buzz around him, which will drive buzz to the podcast. And then we'll kind of ride that wave and then start releasing episodes. Every 2 weeks is kind of the decision that was made, because obviously I've got a lot of other things going on. My bosses didn't want me to spend all my time on the podcast. So the decision was made to do it every 2 weeks and not every week. But so this first episode's live, went really well. The second episode's coming up in the next couple of days here. And then I'm just going to keep recording them in my apartment. I've had Richie Leone reach out saying he would like to co-host it. So maybe he's our kicker or punter. So maybe we'll have to figure that out. Like, I think it'd be great to get more player involvement on it. I just think once we make that decision, it's going to be logistically trying to figure that out, because there is no set space within OSEG. If I bring on a co-host, it's like I only have 2 mics. So we got to get more mics and figure that whole thing out. So I think ultimately I'd like to. And I don't know if you ever watched or listened to the Road Trippin' podcast. It's Channing Frye, Richard Jefferson, Cleveland Cavaliers players. It's kind of slowed down on now, but they were both played for the Cavs back in the day, and so they would record podcasts when they were on the road. And like LeBron James would be on it, Kyrie, like, the Kyrie Flat Earth thing. From that podcast. From there.
Oh, I didn't know that.
So it was like players just kind of like just talking amongst each other. There was like a comms person there that would just make sure like they didn't get too far off topic, or she would ask questions from time to time. But for the most part, it was player driven. So I think that was my original vision, was to make it player driven. But I think that was part of the reason why I was running into issues, because I was like, I gotta get players and I gotta get people to get the players. And like, if I just do it myself, I can just do it. So if I get the co-host Richie, which is ultimately the ideal situation, is just logistically trying to figure out where that lives within OSEG and where the gear comes from and all that. But Yeah, that's a long-winded answer about Red Blacks.
No, that's great. That's like, it sounds like a great opportunity too, because you guys are starting something new. You're building the brand of the players, and I think it's kind of similar to what you guys did with the 67s. I was reading an article where you were touching on how you really wanted to market players kind of individually and kind of show their personality, so the fans could really see that. And that's kind of what you guys are doing now with the Red Blacks Unfiltered. So how do you think that's gonna go? Are there like a lot of players approaching you saying, "I want to be on the podcast. I want to build my brand"? How does that go?
Not necessarily that I want to build my brand, but there's been like I've reached out to players, and every time they're like, "Hey, we have a podcast. You want to be on it?" Always yes. So I have a list of guys now that want to come on the podcast. So, but in terms of like personal brand building, I think it's important because especially within the CFL, because the CFL is stars, but it's not stars on the same level of other leagues. You know what I mean? Like for the like obviously like Arbuckle will get spotted, but like for the most part, our guys can go in anywhere and do their thing, and people don't really like. One of our players is a substitute teacher, JP Bolduc. We actually talked about on the podcast. He's a substitute teacher during the off season. And he said like maybe one kid will notice it when he gets there, but like for the most part, like kids don't realize, and it'll be like halfway through the day they realize he's a player. But like a professional athlete's been teaching you for the last half day and you didn't realize. Whereas like for example, if like Brady Tkachuk was your substitute teacher, you probably realize, right? So it's like I want to make people like really establish a connection with our guys, especially with football players, because you don't get the chance to see them without their helmets really. When they're playing, their faces are covered, they have the big helmets on. So it's really showcasing the personalities, because there's a lot of awesome personalities that are on that team. So it's just kind of giving people that reason to connect. Also because turnover in the CFL is so high. Players come and go. They sign short contracts just the way the money works, the guaranteed money. Players usually sign 1, maybe 2-year contract. And then after that, they're free agent again. So players are always coming and going. So it's how do you maintain that relationship with fans and players if players are constantly cycling in and out? So with the podcast, you get to really learn the story of these guys, and then you get a chance to know them that way and develop a connection through that. That's a big thing for me is personal branding. And then like in the ultimate long term of an individual player branding, like that's kind of on the Red Black side, but on an individual player side, a passion of mine is like, what do players do when they're done playing? You know what I mean? How can they leverage the platform that they have as a pro athlete? Leverage their personality, create a following based on not only them being a personal athlete, but also their interests, so that they're set up for post-playing life. Like you look at the Spit and Chicklets example, like what those guys have done. Why is it on, like some guys are starting to do it now more after watching the success of Spit and Chicklets, but it's like, I think there's just so much opportunity for guys to do stuff like that. So that's growing a personal brand as an athlete. I think it's super important, and there's a lot of people that aren't doing it very well.
I completely agree with that. I actually had like a few ideas where I'd jot down notebooks where start a sports marketing agency, just because, like you mentioned, someone can be a substitute teacher at a school and the kid wouldn't even know. But I'm sure if you say O-lineman for the Red Blacks going to a coffee shop on Bank Street, people would want to go meet him, see how big he is, ask him a few questions. But if it's kind of like how do they get there? And it's kind of things that you guys are doing where you're trying to show that personal brand a bit more through the podcast. Is there different avenues that you guys are trying to go to grow the player brands, or is it mainly just the podcast right now?
I mean, the podcast is one. We do a lot of community stuff with the guys as well. So they're out in the community all the time. Just trying, like, we do the interviews and stuff, but it's trying to get them outside of that environment of doing an interview, because guys go into, like, especially hockey players, more so football players, you get the same standard lines every single time. So in terms of growing the personal brands of the players, podcast is probably the biggest way we're doing it right now. But I would like to try and figure out other ways we can do it, whether it's, again, it's a resources and a money thing, but if we could do like a 24 hours with and follow a player around for the day, like what they're doing. We have a new series that we've started called Our Nation, Inside Our Nation. And it's like long form sit downs that we break out into little clips. So that was kind of the idea of my boss, was to do that one. And so we have it with Marcel talking about himself a little bit. So we're trying different things out. Marcel's our GM, but we're trying different things out with trying to just tell those player stories. And I think the podcast is the ideal platform for it, obviously, right? Because they're long. The Nick Arbuckle one was short because it was about 20-25 minutes because of just timing with him and him being in town for a little bit. But like the next one's 45 minutes. So you really get to learn a player in that context that you don't get them anywhere else. That's kind of, I guess the podcast would be the main way we're doing it right now.
For sure. I was kind of just going to touch on a quick question that I just got right now, but what do you think the potential of teams in the future having like an individual player marketing department, where that whole department's focus is building that player's brand off the field, so once they retire or once they move on, they'd be able to do well for themselves?
I think that's interesting. I think there is a place for that, but I think it's going to be difficult because I mean, ultimately it depends on who the decision maker is on each of the individual teams. But I think like looking at it from the negative side is like, why would I pay a bunch of money why would I hire somebody to work with the athletes to build their brand and not our own? And but at the end of the day, if the player builds their brand and they're still playing for you, then people are going to come. So it all depends how people look at it. I think that would make a lot of sense to do it that way. But I don't think it's going to happen. Yeah, of course. Especially in the maybe I would like to be wrong. But I think ultimately, like right now, like you see guys going out and getting their own people. So it's going to come down to the players, right? And especially because if a player really wants, he's going to go pay for it. So why would I hire someone if a player doesn't even want to do it in the first place? So if a player wants it, they'll pay for it. So I think to your point with an agency, I think that's going to be the more common route than anything. But
something more realistic, maybe just like having some seminars or courses for the players, just to be like, hey, this is how you do a podcast. This is how you post on or schedule posts. Just something like that, I guess, would be something more realistic. Yeah,
and I think if the players do have those questions, like they'll probably come to me with them or to my boss, and then it'll trickle down to me if he can't answer them. But yeah, I mean, I would like to see it because I think there's so much personality with these players, and you don't always get to see it. So I think that's what Spit and Chicklets. That's the biggest strength of that podcast.
Yeah, it's a great podcast.
It's great. I listen to every single one.
Oh, same. Yeah.
But if they just talked hockey, I don't think it'd be the same. It's those interviews where you get to see what these people are really like and you get to hear those stories. Sure. That's a big thing I play on is stories and storytelling. And that's like the premise of my podcast, the podcast that I do with the Red Blacks. It's just telling the stories because that's what people love to hear. And like through those stories, their personalities come out. So
sure, yeah. So now I just want to touch on finally, I don't think it'd be a podcast with Jacob Kelly if we didn't talk about podcasting. It's a funny story actually because the whole idea that I got to start my podcast was through one of our meetings, and I just kind of want to touch on what initially gave you the idea. Was it just trying to grow your personal brand, or do you want to just talk about your social life podcast? Or my social life.
Yeah, so that one was a combination of things. We kind of hit on both of them. Was wanting to grow my personal brand, and just listening to podcasts. I'm like, oh, this is cool. Maybe I should start my own.
For sure.
And so I tried, like, I didn't understand in the context of trying to grow my personal brand at the time. Like that wasn't a concept in my brain, but I'd always tried to like be a personality to some degree. Like I had a vlog channel when I was 18. I had a sports show when I was 19 where I would talk. I don't know if you ever watched Philip DeFranco. Yeah. So my concept was Philip DeFranco once said in a video, if you're looking for a specific type of channel on YouTube and you can't find it, become that channel. And so I loved when Phil DeFranco talked about sports, but he only did it every once in a while. I was like, I wish he just had like a sports show. And I was like, oh, maybe I'll just do the sports show. So I tried to do like a Philip DeFranco-esque show talking about sports. That one, I'd probably 17 episodes maybe, got like 70 subscribers, nothing crazy.
Not bad though.
Yeah, I got bored with it though, and ultimately I stopped doing it. And then I tried to do vlogging again, and that didn't work. And then ultimately it landed on the podcast. So it was through just always wanting to put out content about myself, but not necessarily being able to stick with anything. And then I started listening to a lot of podcasts. I think ultimately when I started was when I was working that internship. So at the time I lived in Manotick. So I was driving and then busing in probably 45 minutes, an hour commute. That's when I really started listening to podcasts. So it was through then that I started listening, and I listened for about a year and a bit. Then I was like, I should start my own. And then it took me 6 months of deciding I'm going to start my own to actually starting a podcast. But so it was a combination of listening and loving podcasts and also trying to grow my personal brand. But I didn't know how. And then I ultimately was like, I didn't even know what the podcast was going to be about for the longest time. But then I realized I like social media. I like these YouTubers. Maybe I should try and make a podcast about that. So the original intent was, I still have a YouTube channel when I started the podcast. So the intent was, I'm just going to learn how to grow my YouTube through my podcast. But at the same time, I'm going to be interviewing people with these huge followings that are then going to promote my podcast. And my podcast is going to blow up in no time. Super naive. Didn't happen that way. But that was kind of the original thought process behind the show.
So you kind of touched on how when you created that show, you did 15, 17 episodes, and you kind of got bored of it. What really like keeps you going for the podcast? Like what motivates you, and what makes you not bored of it?
I don't really know. Like I've tried to think about it. Like I think I just enjoy it. It's kind of almost become a routine at this point. That's part of the reason why I keep going. Like it's just like right now I don't have a podcast that I'm recording soon, right? Like I've been messaging people and I'm trying to get anybody getting back to me. And it feels weird without like a podcast to edit or like an upcoming podcast. So I'm trying to nail one or two down in the future. But I just have fallen in love with the interviewing process. I love interviewing. I don't love my prep work, but I love the results of the prep work.
Yeah, of course.
I just like started watching some like actual like real interviewers, like serious interviews, and like watching how they do it and their cadence. And I love watching good interviews now. So I just fall in love with the interviewing process. And I don't know what it is about podcasting. Maybe it's just getting the chance to talk to people and network with people I never would have had the chance to meet. The New York one is always the one where I say like we recorded 10 podcasts in 6 days. We recorded 3 podcasts in a single day, and I was still having as much fun with the third podcast of the day as the first one. So I don't know what it is. I think it's just getting the chance to talk to somebody in a context that you don't normally get to, because another thing with podcasting too is you get to cover topics you don't cover in a normal conversation.
For sure, yeah.
So like when I go, for example, when I meet someone for coffee, I've never once been like, what's some of the best advice you've ever gotten?
Yeah, okay.
But on my podcast, I can ask that, and that's no problem.
Yeah.
We can talk about like dreams and goals on a podcast, but like if I were to meet one of my buddies, like we're just hanging out, talking about dreams and goals would probably be a bit of a weird topic to just bring up if we're just hanging out, right? Yeah. So like the podcast also creates an environment where you can talk about deeper topics and meaningful topics that if you were just to casually try and bring up in a regular conversation would be weird.
Yeah, sure. No, that's fair. I get that. I think maybe I might be a little weird then because I do bring up those topics.
That's okay though. That's good though.
Yeah. But so I just kind of want to bring everything kind of full circle. We kind of touched on where you started off. You were in Algonquin, then you made your way into the internship and then the 67s and Red Blacks. Where do you see yourself going in the next few years, 5, 10? What's the goal? Like, what do you want to do?
That's interesting. I've never had a goal.
Okay.
You know, like not that I've never had a goal, but I've never been like, this is my aim. This is what I'm going to do. I'm going to everything. Like I just kind of have just gone through life and trying things and figuring things out as I go along. And through that, I create new goals and new objectives, but like I don't really know what that looks like. Maybe some way I find a way to take that athlete personal branding thing and make that a part of not necessarily my job. Maybe it's within OSEG, maybe it's outside of OSEG. But I think athlete personal branding is interesting, leveraging my talents with marketing to do other stuff. I haven't really thought about too much. Maybe it's like I do have like just like a part-time client right now, just like making a little bit extra money, leveraging those skills. Maybe I dive deeper into that. I don't really know. I mean, right now we're preparing for the season, but I really I don't know where I'm going to be in 10 years. I don't really think about it very often.
Yeah, just living life and see where it goes.
Yeah, exactly.
And then kind of just want to, do you have any advice other than doing stuff like starting a podcast or someone that's trying to enter the sports industry? Or if you had to talk to Jacob when he was 18 coming out of Algonquin, like what would you say to them, whether it's career or life advice? What would you say?
My big thing, like the advice I usually give is just start, because I feel like people debate things a lot. They don't actually start. But I think like my advice for someone getting into sports, again, I think the podcast is a big one. Just shoot your shot more so than anything. Not necessarily start a podcast, but shoot your shot. Don't say no for someone before they've said no to you.
Fair, yeah.
You know what I mean? Like you might be like, oh, I was going to message this guy that works for insert sports team, but he's never going to answer me, so I'm not going to do it. You just said like no for him.
Yeah, I get what you're saying. Yeah.
So shoot your shot, because you never actually know. I recorded an episode of my podcast. It's coming out in a couple of weeks with this guy named Jordan McDonald, and he worked for a company, I can't remember, Canvas Pop maybe, something like that. And his boss told him like once a week or something like that, message someone that you want to just learn from, because eventually someone's going to say yes. It's a numbers game. Not every single person will say yes, but sometimes it just takes one person to say yes. And he'd message people all the time, and the first person that got back to him, that Skyped him for half an hour to talk to him, was the lead designer at Nike.
Oh, wow.
Just because he asked, right? So just ask people that you want to learn from, especially like people are willing to share what they know, especially if someone that doesn't often get asked, right?
For sure, yeah.
Like some people, like obviously if it's like someone that does a lot of podcasts and a lot of interviews and stuff like that, might be harder, especially if you're not providing something like a podcast or an interview setting for them. But just shoot your shot and ask, because you never know who's going to say yes. And sometimes all you need to change your life is that one yes.
Sure. It's kind of like the squeaky wheel gets the oil, I guess. Eh?
Yeah.
So is there anything else you want to share, whether it's touching on your podcast or anything? Just a reference, it's My Social Life Podcast. Where can they find it? Or
I mean, it's available everywhere. Apple, Spotify, Google Podcasts, kind of wherever you get your podcast. I have it on YouTube. My YouTube doesn't do very well, except for one random video that it's like my videos will probably get like, I'll put an episode, I might get 10 to 12 views on YouTube. And for the most part, they're all like that. And I have one video that randomly is probably over 20,000 views now.
Really? What's the video?
It's a 2-hour interview with a YouTuber named Just Dustin.
Okay.
So in his videos, the way I could describe to people is in his videos, he's literally bouncing off the walls. Like sometimes he'll jump and kick off the wall, and like he's just high energy in his videos. He's geared more towards a bit of a younger demo. And I got him for 2 hours sitting back in his chair talking about YouTube analytics and why it's so important and how he like uses the data to influence his videos. So I got him in a setting no one ever really gets him in, and I got him for 2 hours like that. And the video went out, was like one of my regular videos. 12 views. It kind of picked up a little bit, hit 100. I was like, oh, that's dope. And then it's back to that guy, Jordan McDonald, who had my podcast. He was over and he's like, yeah, I saw your Just Dustin video is your most viewed video on YouTube. And I was like, no, it's not. I was like, it's my one with Hayden Cashin. He's like, no, it's the Just Dustin one. I looked like 2 days ago, it has 3,000 views. And I was like, what the hell? So I go and look, it has 3,000 views and like good YouTube average view duration. I'm getting into a total tangent here, but
go for it.
Average view duration on YouTube, like a good view duration is about 5 minutes. Anything above 5 minutes is really good. This video is rocking an hour and a half average view duration with over 20,000 views. It has like some almost 30,000 watch hours now.
That's nuts.
Which I don't understand. Like it literally, like I didn't change anything. The thumbnails stayed the same. The tags have stayed the same, and it just randomly picked up. So that was a total random tangent on my social life's YouTube. But yeah, you can listen to my podcast forever. But more importantly, before you subscribe to my podcast, you guys have to subscribe to The Route.
I don't think I could have said it any better myself, other than to listen to Jacob, subscribe to The Route, and to thank him for being the very first guest of The Route podcast. I think he's excellent. I think he provided some great insight, and I hope you guys enjoyed him as much as I did. As for the podcast going forward, I was planning on only having a podcast come out every second week. But due to the crazy circumstances and how everyone's at home at the moment, I decided to release a podcast next week and possibly a second one as well. As for the guests, I've been mixing them around, kind of see which one's more relevant with the current times and with sports being off. I've decided to put Dave Harris as the first guest next week. He's involved with esports as he's a managing director of a group there in Australia, and he really touches on various things in esports that may not be aware about. So I find it's extremely relevant, and as he says, esports are the only real show in town at the moment. So it's great to hear more about it and to kind of expand our view of what we can be looking out for and watching and what to stay tuned for. So I hope you guys enjoyed this episode. Stay tuned for episodes next week and to subscribe, and thanks for listening.